Let's talk on. We've touched on John Brown, a little bit on David Walker. Let's talk about Nat Turner and his rebellion.
Sure.
I guess you give us some background on Nat Turner, who he was, and what he did.
He's a slave.
He's currently? No, I'm just.
No, he met his demise pretty quickly after the revolt.
Yeah.
He's interesting in the sense that he's one of these. Is an interesting feature in plantation life in some parts of the South. There was an itinerant preacher in some cases that literally a slave owner would have, and Nat Turner was a preacher, and so he would go to multiple plantations during a Sunday, and young good.
Okay.
And he would preach, and have religious services on this plantation, and then a little bit later he'd go to a neighboring plantation and he'd do church services.
He would jump around to these different plantations and do sermons.
Great speaker. Somewhat of a mystic, because to your observation, he occasionally would express that he had visions and interpreted celestial events in the sky in terms of it meaning having not only heavenly significance, but significance in terms of what he ought to do in terms of slave revolt. So he was able to circulate around in various plantations. He networked and had a whole network of folks that eventually would join with him in this revolt in the 1830s in Virginia. It's interesting. It begs this. I think it's so interesting when you think about David Walker, African-American freedman, Nat Turner, African-American slave, South, John Brown, white freedman. So, okay, who's the better abolitionist? William Lloyd Garrison writes in a newspaper and publishes.
Okay,
so who's better abolitionist?
William Lloyd Garrison.
He's a white reformer. In the age of Jackson, before the Civil War, America
Jackson.
Yes. Okay. In the age of Jackson, America went through a phase that had tremendous reform movements. Oh, you couldn't swing a dead cat without. Sorry for the PETA people. Sorry. Sorry. Mike, can you edit that one out?
Hopefully, that's in touch. Oh no, you get some publicity.
Anyway, there were all kinds of reform movements pre-Civil War. America got real concerned about becoming a better place, and abolitionism was one of those. But William Lloyd Garrison was one of these white abolitionists, and he felt like if he published enough essays and printed enough persuasive essays that people would be convinced, oh, gee, slavery is bad. So the current debate about abolitionism is like, who's better at it? Are whites who publish newspapers like Garrison? Are whites like John Brown who are engaged in vigilante activity and arming the slaves? Are they better?
Meaning better as in more effective?
More effective,
okay.
Exactly. That's a better way, yeah. Or is David Walker better writing essays as an African American? Or is Nat Turner better at abolitionism with revolt? I mean, what is abolitionism? I mean, I'll pose this question to you. I ran across a scholar a couple of years ago. He did some field work, and they found on this far back corner of some plantation, I forget where, it was a huge cache of farm implements. Like all the wood had rotted away, but there were shovels and rakes.
Farm implements?
Yeah, just like
what is
like picks and hoes and shovels and they were just like hundreds of them buried in the ground in the corner of this plantation. So I was like, what the heck? What is this?
Yeah.
So they speculate, and I think for good cause, that what slaves would do is they would get their farm implement for the day to go out and work in the fields, and they'd bust the handle and bury this stuff in the back 40 and show up and say, well, master, I don't know where the shovel is. I can't. Is that
the handle broke? It's worth nothing now.
Or it was common for a lot of horses and cattle on plantations to have their back hindquarters tremendously scarred. What slaves would do is they would cut these animals and bleed them, so they became very, very weak and couldn't be used in the field. So our African Americans
as a means to eventually rebel.
Well, is that abolitionism? Well, it's not liberating all the whole race from slavery, but it might be liberating a particular slave from slavery for a day.
It's a start. Right?
So what is abolitionism? And that's an interesting discussion I think that historians are having, and that ties into the larger question: is abolitionism effective if it's done by African Americans that are freedmen or African Americans that are slaves? Is abolitionism better by a white person like John Brown or a white person like William Lloyd Garrison? So for your listeners, I think it might be interesting to take those four people, a freed black, a slave black, a freed white,
a violent one,
and a freed white that's writing essays.
Yeah.
So that, and then kind of in the middle of all that is Frederick Douglass, where he's an ex-slave who now is involved in writing essays and being kind of the cause celeb of the abolition movement, a remarkable one. So Nat Turner is so interesting because it's one strand of abolitionism that's going on pre-Civil War. And again, to my point, I think we should think of it as a civil rights movement long before the 1950s.
This was always happening from the beginning.
That's my argument. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess let's go over quickly like what actually happened with the rebellion. I mean, what were the logistics of it?
Well, at a certain time, the fire bell would be a signal. I forget what the signal was, but slaves would literally go around and go into slave owners' homes and kill them in their beds, which they did. So there were a lot of white people that were killed in that initial night on Nat Turner's rebellion, and immediately it spreads to other plantations. So immediately, very quickly in that county, the word went out, and slave owners and white people gathered to put down the rebellion, and they do in a vicious, barbaric way. I mean, they literally chopped Nat Turner up in pieces and sold his fingers as mementos, and just the reprisals were horrific as a way to say, don't do this ever.
Well, I do want to say, Nat Turner's idea behind his initial revolt. I mean, he was, I believe he was killing men, women, and children.
Yes.
White men, any white people he came across,
yes.
regardless of age, gender,
right.
He would kill them. And I believe he didn't believe in this just like, oh, let's just kill anybody, they're white, whatever. The idea, I believe, from what he said or is to strike fear and the shock factor.
Sure.
And hopefully, maybe whites in the north or even some whites in the south might look at this and be like, okay, well, this doesn't come from nowhere. Or just right. be shocked at, right. That this is sure. possible.
Well, think about I think, strike fear is an interesting phrase. I'm glad you mentioned that because I guess I think about it this way. If you're a slave and, say, a runaway is caught in Massachusetts and brought back to your plantation, and there's a public beating to show all the slaves on the plantation, what happens if you're a runaway and you get caught?
And did that happen in Massachusetts? Because
Massachusetts
was banned in Massachusetts.
Correct, but all over the North, because of the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, you could go north, and if you could get a court through a court proceeding to admit, yes, this is my slave, you now can take your property back. So it happened all the time that the Fugitive Slave Clause allows for this, and various state laws that were enacted because of that Fugitive Slave Clause. So to your point about fear, I would recommend that you think about, well, the system of slavery is based upon fear.
Definitely.
And so when Nat Turner says, let's strike fear, he understands fear and how it operates coming towards the slave. That it's a fear, and people understand that. So I think he's tapping into a very primitive urge and understanding of how the fear
this
works.
Will get people scared.
Absolutely.
Pardon my French, shitless.
Yeah.
And it did. So let's touch on
French, by the way.
Well, no, but people say "pardon my French" and then they let off with some. Yeah, I'm sure there's maybe like a French root in there. I don't know.
I don't think so. But
we'll have to figure that one out.
We digress.
Yeah. Yes. But like you were saying earlier, the reaction in the South to this rebellion was absolutely horrific.
Yeah. Well, immediately they cut down on states enacted laws where you weren't going to have itinerant preachers anymore. Rome went around. So slave owners
they passed something where you couldn't have a church service.
Correct.
Without a white minister there.
Yes. all that happens after Nat Turner, because for the most part, the owners would allow slaves to have their own services separate, and after that, no, there had to be a white preacher, or the itinerant preacher could be there, but there was a white person, usually the slave driver, attending the service to make sure everything was, there wasn't sedition being preached in the pulpit.
And after this, I mean, there was one militia in the South after this and Nat Turner's rebellion that supposedly they touted that they had killed 40 blacks in one day, and I mean they were taking stuff off their dead, anything of value off their dead bodies. They boasted they got $21 or something from, and this was all over. I mean, they were attacking blacks indiscriminately. After this, I mean, and the reaction, can you talk about the reaction in the local area of, I'm not sure even where it was located.
Well, in Virginia. Well, the South, the reaction is, this is what we're going to do. Slavery is protected by our laws. Slavery is a good thing because we as white people are taking care of inferior peoples. We're giving them a place to live. We're giving them Christianity. We're allowing them to be converted to Christianity. So the paternal system of slavery, in addition to the economic and the cruelty of slavery, the Southerners just don't understand why this would happen, because in their mind, slaves should be happy.
We treat them well.
We
give them church services. We give them food.
Yes. Their argument was it's a paternal system. Fatherly care. I mean, fathers care for their children.
Like the Ku Klux Klan.
They make many of those paternal arguments later. The Klan does.
When you say paternal, I mean, what do you?
It's a Latin root, pater, father. Fatherly care is paternalism. When you have children, you're supposed to care for your children and provide pants and shoes and quality education and the occasional trip to Disney World. And in exchange, not good. You get the love and admiration of your children for doing these fatherly care type things for them.
So that was their idea. We're giving them this fatherly care, and so therefore I don't understand why they would want to kill us, even though we whip them and rape their women.
There's a great Southern writer. His name is last name is Fitzhugh. He was probably the greatest spokesman for this Southern paternalism, and he wrote for a lot on this paternalism of the South. So Southerners, like to your question of like how does the South react to this slave revolt? They just, first of all, they're scared to death, but then they're also like, why would these slaves do this? We treat them as family.
That's remarkable that question was actually there.
Well, a father occasionally has to discipline his children, for their own good. So the slave.
So that was their thought.
Yeah. So we occasionally have to discipline.
Sometimes we gotta whip them until we can see their spine.
Well, I'm not sure anybody's going to make that argument, but I mean that's the reality. That's the reality. But the argument, devoid of all fact, is it's a Southern paternal system, family system, and so there was a lot of head scratching at the slave revolts. Now the North, they could always wag their finger and see how barbaric the South is, especially if you're an abolitionist. Now, if you could care less, if you're a Northerner and you're ambivalent about slavery, you're going to say, well, I don't care. It's a Southern problem. Let them deal with it. If you want slavery, fine. That's what you're going to have to deal with. Not my problem. So the reaction was mixed.
Okay. That's very interesting to me.